Pope Francis had always been a symbol of hope and reform, a humble leader willing to challenge centuries of tradition. But when he died unexpectedly on Easter Monday 2025, the world was left in shock. In the shadows of his passing, a former Vatican insider named Maria D'Angelo, a whistleblower who had once worked alongside the highest ranks of the Church, stepped forward with a chilling story. Maria claimed that Pope Francis had uncovered a dangerous conspiracy within the Vatican, a web of power and corruption stretching back centuries. As she revealed her startling discoveries, it became clear the death of Pope Francis was no accident. Was it a divine sign, or had powerful forces within the Vatican silenced him to protect their dark secrets? People gathered in churches, filled with hope and devotion, to celebrate the resurrection of Christ. However, the morning brought an unthinkable shock. At 7 a.m., the Vatican confirmed that Pope Francis, the beloved pontiff, had passed away unexpectedly in his sleep. The news spread like wildfire, leaving millions around the world in a state of disbelief. At 88 years old, Pope Francis had lived a full life of service to the Church, known for his progressive views, humble lifestyle, and deep empathy. He was a pope unlike any before him, striving to bridge divides and reach out to the marginalized. His unexpected death, occurring on Easter Sunday itself, felt almost symbolic. The timing seemed far too perfect, too significant, to ignore. For many, it was as though the world had lost not only a leader, but a spiritual figure whose mission had been far from complete. The Vatican described his death as peaceful, but the circumstances surrounding it were far from ordinary. Those close to Pope Francis claimed that he had seemed healthy, though his health had been slowly declining in recent months. His passing on this sacred day, of all days, raised immediate questions. Was this simply a coincidence, a natural conclusion to a long life? Or was there something deeper at play? Was it a divine sign, or perhaps a carefully orchestrated event? As news outlets rushed to cover the story, many began to speculate about the significance of his death on such a holy day. Some even whispered that his death was tied to prophecies that had long been circulating within the Church, prophecies that some had considered too outlandish to believe. This set the stage for an investigation into what many now called a mystery, wrapped in a divine puzzle. As the world mourned Pope Francis's death, a group of investigators began sifting through the pontiff's life, seeking answers that could explain his sudden passing. Their focus turned to an old, nearly forgotten prophecy that had been circulating for centuries among certain circles within the Catholic Church. The prophecy, dating back to the 12th century, spoke of a pope who would die on Easter Sunday, marking the end of an era in the Church. The prophecy had long been dismissed as superstition, a mere coincidence in the annals of Church history. But now, in the wake of Pope Francis' death on that very day, it seemed impossible to ignore. The prophecy described a man of humble origins, someone who would bring a message of peace and humility to the world. This was a fitting description of Pope Francis, who had risen from the slums of Buenos Aires to become the leader of over 1 billion Catholics. However, the prophecy did not just predict his rise to power, it also foretold the time of his death, coinciding with the holiest day in Christianity, Easter Sunday. For many, this eerie alignment seemed more than a coincidence. The prophecy had been vague enough to be interpreted in different ways, but now, in hindsight, it appeared to have been incredibly precise. As investigators dug deeper, they discovered that the Church had been aware of this prophecy for centuries, though it had always been kept in the background, seldom mentioned in public or discussed among Vatican officials. The fact that it seemed to align so perfectly with Pope Francis' life and death raised troubling questions. Was his death simply the culmination of a natural lifespan, or had the prophecy somehow shaped the course of his life, and perhaps his final days? Could there have been other, hidden influences at play? The more the investigators uncovered, the more they realized that Pope Francis might have been part of a larger, more mysterious narrative, one that reached far beyond his tenure as Pope. As the investigation into Pope Francis's sudden death continued, a darker and more complex narrative began to unfold. Behind the carefully curated public image of the pontiff, there were whispers of secrets within the Vatican that had long been hidden from the outside world. Pope Francis, despite his reputation for transparency, had begun to retreat into the more private corners of the Vatican in his final months. Those closest to him recalled increasingly frequent closed-door meetings with high-ranking officials, conversations that seemed urgent and shrouded in mystery. The nature of these discussions was never fully disclosed, but their secrecy seemed out of character for the open-hearted pope the world had come to admire. Rumors began to surface about a mysterious document, one that had been kept hidden within the vaults of the Vatican for centuries. The contents of this document were not widely known, but it was said to contain revelations that could change the way the Church viewed its own history and the world itself. Some believed it contained ancient prophecies, while others suggested it was a guide to a more radical transformation within the Church. Regardless of its true nature, Pope Francis was believed to have been preparing to reveal its existence and contents in the near future. As his health began to fail, Pope Francis reportedly became more focused on this document, as if he understood that time was running out. There were accounts from insiders who claimed that he was determined to unearth the truth within it, hoping to steer the Church into a new era. Yet just days before his death, the document remained locked away, its secret still hidden. Was it mere coincidence that Pope Francis died just as he was about to bring this information to light? Or did his death have a more deliberate timing? Was he silenced before he could reveal something dangerous? Something that could threaten the very foundation of the Vatican? The investigators could not help but wonder, had the Pope's passing been the result of natural causes, or had he been prevented from uncovering a truth that some powerful people within the Vatican were desperate to keep buried? As the investigation deepened, a chilling pattern began to emerge, one that suggested Pope Francis's life was intertwined with a series of strange, seemingly inexplicable events. These events, scattered throughout his papacy, now appeared to be more than mere coincidences. The investigators identified 7 key moments that stood out as particularly cryptic, each one linked to prophecies, visions, or occurrences that defied rational explanation. The first of these events occurred early in Pope Francis's tenure, when he visited a remote village in the Andes. While there, he had a private audience with a local shaman, a figure known for his deep spiritual insights. The meeting was never publicly disclosed, but the shaman reportedly told Pope Francis of a vision, one that warned of a looming crisis within the Church, a great darkness that would fall over its leadership. Was this an innocent exchange of spiritual wisdom, or was the Pope being given a warning that he could not ignore? The second event happened years later when Pope Francis was preparing for a major ecumenical council. He was said to have received a mysterious letter, sent anonymously, that warned him of a conspiracy brewing within the Vatican. The letter contained cryptic references to historical figures and secret alliances, but no one could decipher its full meaning. Yet, after reading it, Pope Francis became more secretive, increasingly withdrawing into his own thoughts. Had he uncovered something disturbing, or was the letter simply the work of a paranoid mind? Other events followed, each one seemingly linked to the strange occurrences around the Pope's life. A vision he reportedly had during a visit to the Holy Land, in which he saw a shadowy figure standing at the gates of Jerusalem. The strange illness that struck him on the eve of a papal conclave, leaving him bedridden for days. And, perhaps most puzzling, a series of private meetings with influential world leaders who had ties to powerful secret societies. Were these encounters merely coincidental, or was Pope Francis being drawn into a web of intrigue far beyond the Church's walls? As these 7 events were pieced together, the investigators couldn't help but wonder, was Pope Francis's life marked by these strange occurrences, or had he been the central figure in a much larger, more mysterious narrative? One that reached back centuries and had a much darker purpose. With each revelation, the line between coincidence and something far more sinister began to blur, and the mystery surrounding his death deepened. In the weeks following Pope Francis's death, a closer look at his final days revealed something that could not be easily explained away. Before his passing, he had been meticulously preparing his Easter message, a tradition followed by every pope. But this year, his message was different. It was unlike anything he had delivered in the past. His words were cryptic, urgent, and seemed to carry a weight far beyond the typical themes of hope and renewal. Those who had read drafts of the message described it as a call for a radical change within the Church, one that would challenge centuries of tradition and potentially reshape the future of Catholicism. There were references to unity among all people, but also veiled mentions of a great cleansing that needed to occur within the Vatican. The language was symbolic, filled with metaphors that seemed to suggest a dark undercurrent, an impending shift that would not be easy or without sacrifice. Some parts of the message were so obscure that even his closest advisors could not decipher them fully. These sections seemed to hint at secret struggles within the Church and the need for transparency and healing. Yet what was most striking were the passages about prophecy. Pope Francis appeared to have a deep understanding of an ancient prediction that had long been kept in the shadows, one that foretold a great change for the Church. He had even gone so far as to mention that the time had come for the Church to face its darkest secrets. It was a powerful, almost unsettling message, one that would have surely sent shockwaves throughout the Catholic world if it had been delivered. However, as his health declined in those final days, Pope Francis became increasingly reclusive, unwilling or unable to discuss the content of his message in detail. Some believe that his sudden death prevented him from revealing what he had come to understand about the future of the Church and the secrets that lay hidden within it. What exactly did Pope Francis know? And why was he so determined to prepare a message that seemed to hold the key to something much larger than a simple Easter reflection? As the world mourned his passing, the true meaning of his final words remained a mystery, one that would continue to haunt the investigation. As the investigation into Pope Francis's death delved deeper, unsettling revelations began to emerge, pointing to a shadowy past within the Vatican. The Church, long seen as the spiritual heart of the world, was also an institution shrouded in secrets. The more the investigators uncovered, the clearer it became that there were forces within the Vatican that had operated for centuries in the darkness, hidden from the public eye. While Pope Francis had always championed transparency and reform, he had also been aware of the deep-rooted corruption that plagued the Church. His efforts to challenge these entrenched powers had earned him both admiration and powerful enemies. For our Vatican, with its centuries of history, was far more than a religious institution. It was a political entity, a powerhouse with ties to some of the wealthiest and most influential families and organizations in the world. Over the years, rumors had circulated about secret societies, ancient alliances, and hidden agendas that manipulated the course of history. But Pope Francis, ever the reformer, had been intent on dismantling these shadows, even if it meant alienating those at the top of the ecclesiastical hierarchy. His growing determination to expose the hidden forces controlling the Church's vast wealth and influence had made him a target. Was his death part of a larger plan to silence him before he could reveal the truth? Among the most chilling discoveries was the existence of a hidden archive, long rumored but never confirmed, that contained records dating back to the earliest days of Christianity. These documents were said to contain not only historical accounts of the Church's formation but also cryptic writings about its darker dealings over the centuries. Some even suggested that the archive contained evidence of a covert pact with powerful political and financial interests that had guided the Vatican's policies for centuries. The investigation also uncovered testimony from former insiders who spoke of a secret group of high-ranking Church officials operating behind closed doors who had been deeply involved in the preservation of these secrets. Were these figures responsible for obstructing Pope Francis's efforts to bring about real change? And had they orchestrated his death to ensure that these secrets remained buried? As the investigators followed the trail, they began to realize that the Vatican's true history, far from the sanctified image it projected to the world, was fraught with intrigue, corruption, and betrayal. The question now was whether Pope Francis had truly been killed to protect these secrets, or if his death had been the result of something even more dangerous. As the investigation into the death of Pope Francis progressed, one of the most perplexing revelations emerged from a series of eyewitness accounts about a mysterious visitor who had appeared just days before the Pope's death. Descriptions of the visitor varied, but one thing remained consistent. Pope Francis had met with a figure who seemed to arrive out of nowhere, cloaked in secrecy. This person, who never identified themselves fully, had been seen only in private, Meetings with the Pope. Those closest to the Vatican could never ascertain the visitor's true identity, and the meeting itself was kept under strict confidentiality. According to some accounts, the figure was dressed in dark, nondescript clothing, blending into the shadows, as though trying to avoid being noticed. Their conversation with the Pope was said to be unusually intense, with the two speaking for hours behind closed doors. Sources claimed that the subject matter was not religious in nature, but rather focused on matters of power, influence, and the future of the Church. What was discussed during those private conversations remains a tightly guarded secret, but rumors began to swirl that this visitor was someone with deep ties to forces within the Vatican, or even beyond it. Could they have been an emissary of a secret organization that had been watching Pope Francis's every move, quietly influencing his decisions? The timing of this visitor's appearance was deeply unsettling. Shortly after their meeting with Pope Francis, his health seemed to decline rapidly, and soon after, he passed away. Was this figure a messenger, or perhaps a manipulator of sorts, responsible for either guiding or even orchestrating the events leading to the Pope's death? As investigators tried to track down any trace of this mysterious person, they were met with a wall of silence, further deepening the enigma surrounding Pope Francis's final days. Was this visitor a divine messenger, or were they part of something darker, working in the shadows to ensure that the Pope's vision for reform would never come to fruition? As the investigation into the death of Pope Francis unraveled, the evidence began to suggest a disturbing possibility: that his passing was not simply the result of natural causes, nor a divine event, but part of a much larger, more sinister plot. The investigators, having examined the series of cryptic events, the secret meetings, and the mysterious visitor, started to connect the dots and formulate a chilling theory. Pope Francis, it seemed, had become a pawn in a power struggle within the Vatican, a figure whose every move had been manipulated by forces both inside and outside the Church. The 7 strange occurrences in Pope Francis's life, from his encounters with shadowy figures to the mysterious letters and prophecies, now appeared to be part of a larger narrative of control. It became increasingly clear that these events were not random, but rather orchestrated to influence the direction of his papacy. There were whispers of factions within the Vatican, groups who had long held sway over the Church's leadership, who viewed Pope Francis as a threat to their power. His calls for transparency, reform, and a departure from the old ways had made him enemies among those who were invested in maintaining the status quo. The final pieces of the puzzle suggested that Pope Francis had been more than just a victim of internal Church politics. Could he have been targeted because he was on the brink of exposing something that could have destabilized the Vatican's centuries-old grip on power? His death on Easter Sunday, a day of such deep religious significance, now appeared to have been carefully timed. Was it a divine sign, as some suggested, or had it been engineered by forces within the Vatican to silence him permanently? As the investigators continued their search for answers, they began to realize that Pope Francis's death was not an isolated event, but part of a much larger, ongoing struggle for control within the Church, one that could have far-reaching consequences for the future of Catholicism. As the investigation into Pope Francis's death reached its climax, an unexpected breakthrough emerged. A whistleblower from within the Vatican came forward with startling revelations that seemed to confirm the darkest suspicions. The insider, a former high-ranking Vatican official, revealed that there had been a covert operation within the Vatican, orchestrated by a small group of powerful cardinals, aimed at undermining Pope Francis and his reform efforts. According to this whistleblower, Pope Francis had been increasingly isolated in his final months, surrounded by individuals whose loyalties were not entirely to him, but to the entrenched power structures that had long controlled the Vatican. Taikubiu. Whistleblower claimed that this group had been working behind the scenes to manipulate key decisions, subtly guiding the Pope's actions in directions that would benefit their interests. They had managed to keep Pope Francis from fully realizing the extent of their influence, leading him to believe that he was in control of his papacy, when in reality, they were pulling the strings. This group, the whistleblower suggested, feared that Pope Francis's reforms, his calls for transparency, accountability, and a break from the Church's historical ties to wealth and power, would destabilize their carefully cultivated control over the Vatican. Even more disturbing were the details the insider provided about the events leading up to Pope Francis's death. The whistleblower stated that the Pope had become aware of the covert operation and had begun taking steps to confront those responsible. He had even started gathering evidence that could expose the group's manipulation, including financial records and hidden agreements that implicated several powerful cardinals in corruption and illegal activities. Was it possible that Pope Francis was killed to prevent him from revealing this information? Had his death been timed to stop him from uncovering the truth about the Vatican's darkest secrets? The whistleblower's testimony, while shocking, was just the beginning of an even more complex investigation. If Pope Francis had indeed been silenced by those within the Church, it would represent a betrayal of the very principles he had stood for, but it also raised a larger, more unsettling question. Who truly controls the Vatican, and what lengths would they go to in order to protect their power? As the investigation continued, the chilling possibility of a widespread conspiracy within the Church loomed larger than ever before. As the investigation into Pope Francis's death neared its end, the shocking truth began to emerge. The pieces of the puzzle, once scattered and unclear, now formed a picture that was both terrifying and eye-opening. The powerful group within the Vatican that had been working against Pope Francis was not simply a small faction of disgruntled officials. They were part of a much larger, deeply entrenched network that had been manipulating the Church for centuries. This group, consisting of influential cardinals, bankers, and even figures from outside the Vatican, had their own hidden agenda, a control over the Church's immense wealth and influence that had remained unchecked for generations. The more the investigators uncovered, the clearer it became that Pope Francis had been aware of this network and had been actively trying to expose them. His final months had been marked by a growing sense of urgency as he prepared to reveal the extent of the corruption within the Vatican. But those in power, desperate to protect their secrets, had acted swiftly. They had orchestrated his death, carefully ensuring that it would appear natural, an unfortunate but inevitable consequence of old age and declining health. His passing on Easter Sunday was no accident, nor was it a divine sign. It was a deliberate, coldly calculated act. In the wake of Pope Francis's death, the Church had been thrown into turmoil. His death had not only silenced a pope committed to reform, but also left a power vacuum that the very individuals who had conspired against him were eager to fill. With his vision of transparency and change now buried, the Vatican's dark secrets remained safe, at least for the time being. As the investigation concluded, it was clear that the true story behind Pope Francis's death would never be fully understood by the public. But those who had looked beyond the surface saw a disturbing reality. A church, once revered for its holiness, now trapped in a web of deceit and corruption. The death of Pope Francis was not just a loss for the Catholic world. It was a chilling reminder of the lengths to which some would go to protect their power.